right, y'all. Welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I am the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and I've recorded more than 5,000 interviews going back to 2003, all of which are available at scotthorton.org. You can also sign up for the podcast feed. The full archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show.
All right, you guys, introducing the great Coleen Rowley, former Time Person of the Year for 2002. Of course, she was the FBI lawyer who told the real story about Zacarias Moussaoui. Not really the 20th hijacker, but still definitely an Al-Qaeda member and in on all of what surrounded the September 11th plot anyway. And if only they had listened to her, they could have stopped the dang attack. Everybody knows that. And now it's very lucky that we have her as a great anti-war writer on a great many issues. And here she is again at consortiumnews.com. Ghost of J. Edgar haunts Flynn investigation. Welcome back to the show, Coleen. How are you?
Well, I'm fine, except we have mass chaos and violence breaking out 10 miles from where I live with the police shooting the other day. So, I just wrote to someone, I said, I think it's another sign of the empire rotting from the inside.
Yep.
It's very sad for all of us to be witnessing, but you see all these blowback, whatever you want to call it, the Soros of empire blowback. And right now it's pretty up close and personal for us in Minneapolis, but it was just a question of time. And, there's lots of cracks breaking out in the empire. I think if you look at all of this Russiagate and, targeting leaders and all this, so bogus, it's unbelievable. That's another sign of rot in corruption and rot inside an empire as well. You can attribute this all to this really fool's errand notion that the United States was entitled to become the policeman of the world and unilaterally, gain its power over other countries and control the world through illegitimate, completely illegal wars and violence. And unfortunately, the worst of this started after 9/11. I did just want to quickly correct you on one thing about prevention of 9/11. I wrote about that 9/11 could have easily been prevented, but I wasn't the one personally who did the warning. We had 3 or 4 agents, actually, 2 in Minnesota, one of whom called up headquarters in August and said, this is a guy who could fly into the World Trade Center, quote unquote. And the guy in headquarters said, that's not going to happen. So that was the 2 agents here in Minnesota, an agent and his acting supervisor. Then the agent in Phoenix who wrote the memo had noticed that all the Al-Qaeda different terrorism suspects were training in flight schools and had an urgent request that the FBI check out flight schools. And again, they didn't even read his memo, and it was so incredibly urgent. It was incredible. That agent, by the way, his last name is Williams. He testified just 2 weeks before me to the Senate Judiciary, but Robert Mueller was able to co-opt him at the time. And he put his arm, Mueller put his arm around Williams and they walked in together. And Williams testified, I didn't even expect anyone would ever read my memo. He completely reversed what he had written, warning about it. Williams now is quite, after all these years, he's working for the 9/11 families trying to sue Saudi Arabia as an investigator. And he was appalled that the FBI was not going to allow him to help the victims of 9/11 after all of this. It was incredible. So he's finally seen the light. And then there was another agent in New York who warned that people are going to die unless we do something about looking for these 2 hijackers or these 2 terrorists who had come into California. So there were agents. And again, it was quite easy to have at least reduced 9/11, not have totally avoided it or prevented it, but at least to have reduced it greatly. If the people at the top and Richard Clark was trying to warn Condi Rice, and she put him off. They all had their prior agendas before 9/11. Bush wanted to undo the treaties and start the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and Condi Rice wanted to target Russia. They all had Ashcroft wanted to reinstate the death penalty. They all had their prior agendas when they came in, and terrorism was their lowest priority. It was just that simple. Yeah. And then after 9/11 happened, then they use it. The worst thing here is they use this trauma as a pretext to do all these terrible things, including launching war on a country that had nothing to do with the terrorist attack, and in fact was an enemy of the Al-Qaeda and the Wahhabi group. And all these years, then we've never even looked at what was the real problem. Why were we attacked on 9/11? None of this has really been examined, except I should say by you, Scott, and by a few others in alternative media. But the mainstream media has almost never examined this. So we're kind of on this steamrolling, downhill, where one thing just leads to another. And once they allowed mass surveillance of other Americans, and we've pretty much, as I said, the ghost of J. Edgar Hoover, we've gone back to a pre-church committee situation that Hoover was an expert at, because he was spying on all the other leaders in order to maintain his own power and using blackmail against them. And I think we're very, very close to mimicking that situation right now. And you see it in the Flynn case. You see it in the FISA applications for Carter Page. I told someone yesterday that if we don't finally realize, if the politicians don't realize that it was the dumbest thing on their behalf to allow all of those prior standards that were the Attorney General guidelines and the church committee recommendations, and when they undid those, they didn't realize that they were really the first ones to be the potential victims of it. It was like, oh, well, this is going to be used on other people, so I don't care. Everybody was said, oh, well, if you have nothing to be afraid of if you've done nothing wrong, etc. So it's not going to hurt me. I think now maybe some of them, people like Rand Paul and maybe a few others, have woken up to the fact that the leaders that are powerful are actually the ones who are going to be the most likely to be the victims of abuses, different abuses. Once you lower those standards and you have a way around the Fourth Amendment, as they did after 9/11, the most likely people to be hurt by it are going to be other leaders, because now everybody's just like Hoover was using. Hoover was using it for his own power. So anyway, I wrote that article about Flynn case because it's an egregious case. Glenn Greenwald did an even better job. He talked for an hour and 45 minutes about it, and he just really lays it out. But in my experience in the FBI, this is pretty incredible that they turned Title 18 1001 false, making false statements to an agency or to the government, which is supposed to be used only as a warning on applications, so people don't lie on their applications for grants, for government grants, or for even employment. So that's a warning. It's supposed to be used as a warning so people won't lie. We were told in new agents training that we could use it if we thought someone wasn't telling the truth in an interview. We could at least use it as a warning and say, hey, there's a law that if you lie to us, you could be prosecuted. But at the same time, we were told about potentially using that as a warning to get people to tell you the truth. We were also told that it would almost never be prosecuted. Even if the person did lie, it would never be prosecuted. And only sometimes it was used if it was tacked on to another crime. So the rare times that a prosecutor would charge the false statements law would be if it was tacked on to something bigger or more important. It was never used like in the Flynn case, where they tried deliberately to get him to lie just so they could have something to charge him with. because they already knew his interview. I mean, that's turning this law completely on its head. And then, of course, the threats of the Logan Act, which has not been used for 150 years. And even then, I don't think it was ever used successfully. They tried to use it, years and years ago in the 1850s or something once. But the Logan Act, all leaders tend to be, not even leaders, but people are in contact with foreign governments, and especially incoming administrations would be normal for them to be in contact with a foreign government. You couldn't possibly then say that you're going to prosecute them under the Logan Act, and that's what Flynn was threatened with. And again, there's just so many egregious reasons why this Flynn case Judge Sullivan should have immediately dismissed it once the U.S. attorney recommended and Barr agreed that it was really a travesty. It was an entrapment, and they were using it. It was a ploy, a real, like in the notes they call it a game or playing games, and that's exactly what it was. They were playing games to try to get him to lie, and then use it to get him fired, or in this case, when they pushed it, to charge him with making a false statement. But we'll see how it ends. I think Sullivan really went out on a limb in a very unusual way when he called for a friend, not a friend, but another former judge or somebody to write an amicus brief, and that was very unusual. So let's see what happens. But it's a mess and a half right now, that's for sure.
Well, so there's so many different facets of this, but I am somewhat fascinated by the judge's reaction here, where he says, well, I'm not dismissing the charges even if the Justice Department wants to. I'm going to appoint this other lawyer to come in and see whether I should go ahead and see him prosecuted anyway, and possibly even explore a new charge of perjury for changing his plea. Now, to paraphrase Matt Taibbi, he said, now listen, all good liberals are supposed to go along with this because the victim is Flynn, when the correct answer is, this is like the kind of thing you'd see in Belarus. This is insane. Can you even do that? You're an FBI lawyer, formerly, Coleen. Can they do that?
Well, the Judge Sullivan tried to do it. I think he probably is, to be generous with him. I think he's probably is quite brainwashed by all of this Russiagate, as most, the people who have really put their heart and soul into this all along have a difficult time now dismissing it all as the bogus thing that it was from the start. And again, Flynn is just one aspect of it. I mean, the Carter Page is even worse in some ways. They're all really bad. There's a lot of aspects to this Russiagate that were simply, and you don't have to be a fan of Trump or Flynn or Carter Page or any of them. You don't have to be don't have to be their supporters to understand that this is turning our system of justice and fairness, and what I said is going around the Fourth Amendment now under the same exact way that J. Edgar Hoover did, because he did not have a wall. J. Edgar Hoover was allowed to say national security. He was allowed to use those pretexts for bugging, for eavesdropping on Martin Luther King Jr. and, by the way, many other officials in Washington, D.C. The NSA, that minaret program that Frank Church, eventually the Church Committee under Frank Church exposed the some of the CIA and the NSA. They weren't able to expose it all on the NSA and the CIA. They exposed a lot of the COINTELPRO of the FBI, but not that much of the NSA and the CIA. And you come to find out years later that the NSA program back then was actually monitoring Frank Church himself. That's pretty incredible. So Frank Church maybe didn't even know that, but he was one of the main targets of this. Now, again, this is really some horrible stuff that happened in the 60s, and of course, not uncoincidentally during the worst part of the Vietnam War, which I think you have these wars abroad, and the wars abroad are then allowing this internal domestic corruption. And by the way, terrorism breaks out and everything during this time period. And I think that we're seeing this repeat all over again, the same things that happened in the 60s. But I think Judge Sullivan, like others, are just really brainwashed. They watch too much Rachel Maddow, and they can't understand that none of this was true, and that really these are quite egregious abuses. People like Peter, like Strzok in the FBI agent. I think he was also brainwashed. He started to think, we have a Manchurian candidate. They all believed that there was this danger. McCabe probably did. They're in a bubble, kind of like a group think, where they're only getting this reinforcement from inside their own group think bubble. And, you see this, of course, the worst of groupthink is, of course, during World War II with the Nazis and stuff. But groupthink is a common thing. And when you're only seeing and hearing things that confirm your own conspiracy theories or whatever, you're going to get brainwashed. And I think that's what happened here. I think a lot of people then grabbed on to ends justify the means. They said, well, we have such a noble goal. Hoover thought he had a noble goal. He wrote a whole book about basically suspecting a communist hiding behind every tree. And so if you're in that paradigm, like McCarthy and like J. Edgar Hoover, you're going to think that you're entitled then to take these illegal means to accomplish your noble goal.
Okay,
and that's
now,
why
I understand
that's why we need standards to begin with.
But are you sure? I mean, there seem to be so many times in this case, and believe me, I'm a subscriber to your theory, generally speaking, of the self-justification angle. However, it seems like, God, they had to have known they're lying when they put Halper and apparently Misfoot up to go and to talk to Papadopoulos in the first place. And then when they didn't think that they could make a case out of that, they tried to make a case out of Carter Page, and they lied and pretended to not know that the CIA had told them that this guy's with us. He's not a pro-Russian traitor. He's an American patriot and a CIA asset. And then even the fact that, Mueller even launched this investigation at all and kept it going for 2 years and keeping speculation about Trump's treason going for another 2 years. As my friend Dave Smith likes to point out, that when BuzzFeed got it wrong, that Trump had told Michael Cohen to lie to Congress, that Mueller had no problem putting out a press release saying that's just not true. And we're not going that way. Well, he could have told us that it wasn't true that Donald Trump was a pro-Kremlin traitor too. But he didn't. He let people continue to speculate about that and to believe that for another 2 years, which seems to me to be part of the conspiracy just as much as sending Misfoot to try to get Papadopoulos to repeat something back into an open mic in this entrapment in the first place, Open mic, proverbially speaking, you understand?
Yeah, entrapment has become, in a way, a major tactic. After 9/11, the FBI constantly used entrapments in order to, show the public that they were doing something, they were making progress in preventing terrorism. Meanwhile, the real terrorist acts they had no clue about ever, because things get lost in the mix, the haystack, all the stuff they're collecting on people and going after, but then the real ones would get lost. But this fools, and of course our media is easily fooled. So they really gravitated to the use of entrapment as a main weapon. And there's been a couple of books written about it, but that's never really been shot down. Entrapment, I've argued it over and over, and people just cannot understand how if you can get someone to do something, but they never would have done it had you not coerced them or subtly pressured them, etc. They don't understand that that's, that this is wrong. It's easy actually to get people to commit crimes, especially when they're the weaker, and you put in a con artist or somebody, like you said, Mifsud or some of these people, and you put them in there, and they're trying to use their even sometimes it's subtle pressures. It's not like you're twisting their arms, but you're subtly pressuring. It's still wrong. It's still wrong, because what are you doing? You're creating crime. You're supposed to be the ones who are working against it. And, in the history of the FBI, things like operating Whitey Bulger, who's killing, there were agents, and not just a few. Most people now believe it was a few rogue apples. You know what? It really wasn't just a few rogue apples. The worst were the rogue apples, but then all these other people knew it was going on. And the whole of the FBI, no one ever said, is it wrong to operate the top echelon organized criminals? I thought to myself, wow, that's kind of like, why are we operating the top echelon of the crime structure? Does that make much sense for the FBI to be doing that just as a policy? And no one ever spoke against that policy. In fact, they praised the people who got the top echelon informants. And not until Whitey Bulger did they really have a way of saying, hey, here's the problem here. You got the FBI now who is helping commit murders and covering up murders and putting people in prison who weren't the murderers, that were framed, et cetera. By the way, Robert Mueller might have had a role in that too, framing the innocent people for Whitey Bulger's murders. It's incredible that people like that otherwise good people, and I know this sounds real naive, but I think from what I've always witnessed, it's true. Otherwise good people, when they fall into this paradigm of believing the ends justify the means, you heard officials say, we can't follow the Constitution anymore. John Yoo with his, oh yeah, now we can torture, anything up to organ failure. You see people thinking that they don't have to follow the old rules anymore because they have such a noble goal, and it's a lot of it's superiority. But when you break down the rules, those rules existed for a reason, and the main reason is that they try to maintain a standard that will produce the best results overall. And so not torturing people produces the best results. You get the best information, blah blah blah. And then you get people afterwards, falling into this trap of saying we can't follow the old standards that we used to. And lying, by the way, you hear Pompeo say this now. Oh yeah, we were taught at West Point not to cheat or lie, or steal, cheat or lie. And guess what I do in the CIA? Ha ha! That's all we do every day is lie, steal, and steal. And that mentality, I would say, maybe to a lesser extent, maybe Pompeo is one of the worst here. At least he's openly admitting it. But, most people fall into that. If they think the green light is on and that their goal is so noble, they go against everything that they learned in Sunday school and, that we learned in the FBI Academy and that you learned at all these different prior stages of life that you thought were golden rules. And then you get into this situation where your bosses are saying, hey, you got to do this because, the gloves are off and now we got to do this. And I think even, like I said, I think Judge Sullivan has kind of fallen into this a little bit because he's read so much about how bad Flynn is. Flynn has
He even
all
accused
kinds
him of
of
treason, right? At the sentencing before.
Yeah.
And then had to apologize and walk that back. That actually, that's not one of the charges. Yeah, really.
I think Mueller was trying actually to help his buddies to some extent. Comey and Mueller were close, and even Brennan and Clapper. These people all worked together. If you think about how a whistleblower, one of the worst things for a whistleblower is that if they do discover some wrongdoing, they know that they're going to be going against people that they work closely with.
Right.
And, and everybody's going to hate them. Even if it has nothing to do with their friends are still going to hate them afterwards for telling the truth about something.
Yeah. It's still so remarkable, though, that, and I do see what you mean about them convincing themselves that there's something to this enough to continue looking at or whatever. There must have been some of that. And yet you're talking about spying on a major party presidential candidate. You're talking about essentially entrapping a fellow traveler like a nobody. This guy Papadopoulos didn't have any real stature. And then when that didn't work, pretending to believe the Steele dossier's reporting about Page, when the Steele dossier says that the Russians promised Page a 19% ownership stake in Rosneft, the Russian oil company, if only he would seize control of America's sanctions policy toward Russia and fix it for him. Oh, yeah, sure. That is the least plausible lie in the world. I knew the moment I first laid eyes on the Steele dossier that that was obviously a blatant, ridiculous, couldn't possibly be true lie. And therefore, the FBI must have agreed with me about that. They were just pretending to think that it was true in order to use it as a pretext to spy on Page and therefore buy hops the rest of the campaign. And not that I would justify it this way or anything, but we're not talking about spying on Gary Johnson or Jill Stein, who didn't have a snowball's chance in hell no matter what. We're talking about the Republican Party's nominee for President of the United States, who on a regular day has a 50-50 shot at being the next president. And for them to decide that they could do this and launch this investigation against him and his team in that way is just absolutely amazing. And, you know, I don't know. I hear you. Like, if maybe part of them really thought that maybe there was a possibility there was something to this Russia stuff, still enough to it to justify taking on a presidential candidate and then a president-elect and then a newly sworn-in president in the way that they did is something for the history books for sure. You know, it's really something else.
I totally agree with you. I cannot believe how anyone could have read that dossier and have thought it was valid and not have asked questions. They didn't even ask questions. They didn't even question him after they realized he had lied and gone to the media.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, but they had set up like this spreadsheet. I'm not sure on the date on this, right? But they said they had set up this spreadsheet that detailed all of the different assertions of fact in there. And then they had quickly debunked all of it, like a good cop might if he tried.
Yeah, that's really so unexcusable, but I'm going to offer a couple of more devil's advocate explanations for how egregiously bad this was.
Well, you know the devil better than I do, so go ahead.
And one is Peter Principle. You know, people don't like to know Peter Principle. The majority of people, when you say the explanation is that this person is like Ted on Mary Tyler Moore or, you know, Barney Fife, they're in positions 5 or 6 levels beyond their competency. And why? Well, they had interpersonal skills. They were well-liked, all different reasons, but have nothing to do with their competency. And in fact, a lot of these big organizations actually want the competent people at the bottom. I've seen this over and over in the FBI. I read the book, Peter's Principle, way back in college, I think. And then later on in the FBI, I thought, well, why is the guy in the FBI lab who has the degrees in chemistry and physics and, you know, advanced degrees, why is he the lab examiner and his supervisor barely knows a little smidgen of biology? I mean, you saw this over and over. People that couldn't even speak the language were the ones that were supposed to be listening. I mean, I saw this over and over. And meanwhile, the people that rose up to the top, the people like McCabe, they tend to have, you know, almost, I hate to say this, but it's psychopathic talents. They're articulate. They know how to be convincing. They're very ambitious. These are all kind of go hand in glove with psychopathic traits if you ever read the book Wisdom of Psychopathy. So those are the people who rise up, but they are not necessarily competent in their job skills. And so that's another explanation for this. There is a lot of Peter Principle. Lots and lots of Peter Principle all through government, of course, and elsewhere. And then I think the other thing is just that, like what I said about going along, once you have a green light and you think your bosses have told you it's okay to do these things. And, you know, in the highest levels here, people like Brennan and Clapper and Hayden and all these former directors, it'll be interesting to see because someone asked me yesterday about the Durham investigation and how high level it would possibly go. And, obviously the highest level it can possibly go would be, to get people like Brennan and Clapper. And they did a lot of, I'm sure some or all of them were responsible for some of those illegal leaks, just as Comey, was doing. But I think at the very least, they were responsible for that, and probably more. But the question will be, will Durham actually hold any of them accountable? He did punt on the CIA torture, so he has a pretty lame track record for going after officials on things. And at this point, like you said, it's a whole party. It's the Democrat Party leaders. It's also a lot of these former agency directors, and they were kind of giving a green light then to people on lower levels. And of course, the people on the lower levels just kind of say, wow, they're saying it's that dangerous right now. I have got to do what I have to do. And so lying obviously becomes normalized. And this has happened, of course, in the country on so many levels. People constantly point to Trump now about his double talking and stuff. But, Trump is just a symptom of a far greater disease here. There's so much disinformation on the media part and whatever. You see it happening with the coronavirus, where people are saying one thing one day and then turning around the next day and saying the opposite. And I think people are realizing that, what is truth? They kind of almost get very cynical that there is no such thing as truth because, there's so much lying. It's so pernicious and it's so rampant. So those are my flimsy excuses for how this could have happened. And I think the only remaining question is, will any of it potentially get fixed? Will there be any accountability? I think if Flynn is finally exonerated on this, he will probably then, he will probably go a long ways, trying to remedy this. And maybe some of the senators Republican senators especially, maybe they will take it up. There seems to be a chance now to fix the FISA. I'm not real optimistic that they will really fix the FISA process because the secrecy, I was going to say that was one of the other main things here. Scott, you have to understand that when you think what you are doing will never come out and it will always be secret, the doors open up to wrongdoing. When on the other hand, that someone can freedom of information and find out what you did, even if it's a couple years from now or even 10 years from now, people are going to be much more careful, accurate, and cautious, etc. You see the same thing with the police shootings. Until the cameras were rolling, and now that the cameras are rolling, and there is starting to be a little bit of accountability for some of these seriously egregious, abuse of firepower by the police or chokeholds, etc. Now that the cameras are rolling, guess what? Everyone is going to be a lot more careful. What happened here a few days ago in Minneapolis has happened before the cameras, sure. Before the police had cameras, before people had their cell phone cameras rolling. It was happening all the time. It's just that there was no way to prove it, and you had very little accountability. So the good news is transparency and accountability, even though initially it really shocks you, but that's the answer. And with the FISA process, that has to be a part of the fix. If they merely say, oh, we're going to have a devil's advocate type amicus come in and we'll brief them and they can argue on the side of whoever the person being targeted is, that's not going to work, in my opinion. That would be a very meager thing. What they have to do is inject a way for a secret FISA application to eventually, as happened in the Carter Page case, to eventually become public, and not tell the people doing it that this will be covered up for the rest of your life, no matter what you do before a FISA court, no matter what a FISA judge authorizes. To be honest, right. The FISA judge themselves that signed on these things are to blame too. They should have asked a lot more questions.
Well, and FISA is a criminal statute, right? The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And so these guys who lied to the FISA court in order to get their FISA warrant, like, for example, Comey and his people at DOJ in the Page case, they should be going to prison for what they've done, not just for their illegal leaks, but for manipulating, essentially unlawfully using the FISA court against a political opponent.
That's right.
I mean, that's what the law was written to prevent, right? In the wake of Nixon and all this stuff.
In all the thousands of cases of FISA applications that turned out to be wrong, and there were probably hundreds, if not thousands, that turned out to be almost, I wouldn't say as wrong as the Carter Page one. That's terrible. And because of his position in the campaign and trying to use it to go after other people in the campaign. But in all just average cases, there are lots and lots of mistakes. What was the situation before the Carter Page is that they would never, ever see the light of day. And if they never see the light of day, the only thing that an agent could fear would be that a supervisor or an inspector eventually might, they had this OIPR, what's it called, office. I can't remember if there's an office where if there was something like this internally, they would refer it up to that office. And then they would inspect it, and yes, they could maybe hurt a person's career a little bit internally. So there were things that they could do to the agent, but nothing like no agent ever thought they could go to jail for saying wrong things to a FISA judge. And so this has changed things now. The Carter Page, the whole Russiagate fiasco has changed everything. Now, whether the officials will be able to overcome that and continue business as usual, because even Barr signed off on the renewal of the Patriot Act authorities. And, Rand Paul was saying, hey, we have to fix FISA. This is the chance to fix the FISA process. But Barr was not on board. Barr actually signed off on this renewal. And now maybe because Trump has weighed in, but a lot will hinge on the next election. And I don't know if it will be fixed or not. I'm not really that optimistic that it will really be fixed. The real fix to FISA is you need to have a way to make it more like the criminal process, where in fact, because those because the affidavit is given to the court, given to a defense attorney, they basically have the I's dotted and the T's crossed. There is very, very rarely a serious problem in requests for electronic surveillance that go to the regular district court. They're usually 100 pages long. They're perfectly done. One of my jobs in the FBI for 13 years as the legal counsel was to review these Title III applications for surveillance of Americans under the criminal statute. And, we made sure that they were done very, very well. Not like in the Carter Page case where they were written, very quickly and were basically, horrible. And you say, what's the difference between the FISA? It's the same. It's a judge, right? You're going before a judge in both cases. Well, the difference is the agents believe in the FISA, and so does DOJ, and so does everybody involved. They believe it's perpetually secret. And the difference is in the Title III criminal case where you follow the Fourth Amendment, someone's going to know about this. Not right now, they're not going to know about it, but in some time later, they're going to know about it. And that changes everything. That absolutely changes everything. That's why the real fix, if they're to fix the process, has to be a way. And I think I may have told you this story before, but just after I retired, I was at a law conference in Washington, D.C., National Security Law Conference, and I think I was already retired. And I was going through the buffet line, and I happened to be standing next to the general counsel of the FBI. It was just a real coincidence. I was standing next to her. I can't remember her name now. She was kind of a really bad, too. She went along with all of this post 9/11 stuff. And I said to her, there's a 100-page law review that if you had the FISA process and you told the judge, I don't need perpetual secrecy, but please just give us 5 years of secrecy until we can investigate this terrorist enterprise. And at the end of the 5 years, if we still need more secrecy, we'll come back and ask for an extension. And maybe you could even, if it was a really big, horrible terrorist, or if it was espionage, you could even ask for longer times. I said, if that was the case, you would have the agents really being more careful and cautious. Automatically, it would turn into much more like the criminal process. And you know what this general counsel in the FBI said to me at the time? Coleen, that would be a real nuisance. We'd have to keep track of the time of the court orders and the time. That was her excuse. That would be a real nuisance. Uh-huh. And so that's the mentality. If you don't have to do something, even though there's a perfect fix to this really bad FISA process, they won't even entertain the idea, a suggestion from somebody that would make sense.
Right. Hey, man, you guys are going to love No Dev, No Ops, No IT by Hussein Badakhshani. It's a fun and interesting read all about how to run your high-tech company like a good libertarian should. Forget all the junk. Read No Dev, No Ops, No IT by Hussein Badakhshani. Find it in the margin at scotthorton.org. Hey, y'all, here's the thing. Donate $100 to the Scott Horton Show, and you can get a QR code commodity disc as my gift to you. It's a 1-ounce silver disc with a QR code on the back. You take a picture of it with your phone, and it gives you the instant spot price and lets you know what that ounce of silver is worth on the market in Federal Reserve notes in real time. It's the future of currency in the past, too. CommodityDiscs.com, or just go to scotthorton.org/donate. Hey guys, Scott Horton here for ExpandDesigns.com. Harley Abbott and his crew do an outstanding job designing, building, and maintaining my sites, and they'll do great work for you. You need a new website? Go to ExpandDesigns.com/Scott and save $500.
Again, sounds like typical bureaucratic incentives in politics and everything like that. No different than we'd expect. I used to, I've spoken to him for a long time, but I used to speak occasionally with Frederick Whitehurst, who was the whistleblower from the FBI crime lab. And I think this was off the air. I was just talking with him and was asking him about September 11th or maybe even on Oklahoma City, because he had been a whistleblower on Oklahoma City. And I was asking him about, why they didn't follow all the leads to the Nazis who were involved in the plot with McVeigh and all that. They were all FBI informants. You understand how it goes. But anyway, he said to me something like, listen, if a regular beat FBI agent goes to his supervisor and says, hey, check it out. I found out all this stuff and I got all these leads and I want to follow them. That, the average American might expect that the supervisor would say, great job, Jenkins, get back out there and tell me what you find. But instead, that even if it really is good work, and even if for whatever political reasons the supervisor decides that, yes, they should continue to pursue these angles, they're probably going to turn it over to another cop instead of letting the guy who was on the right track in the first place continue doing what he's doing. And just because, essentially like some sitcom or whatever, like the Peter Principle or whatever kind of thing, that you can just always expect them to do the wrong thing. You could never expect them to do what any regular Joe would assume that they would do, which is say, good job, Jenkins, get back out there and finish it up. And that it just doesn't work that way. It never does. And so that's why everything is screwed up, is because it has to be.
Yeah. And, Frederick Whitehurst would probably be the first to agree with me about the Peter principle. He's actually the example I was mentioning.
Right.
He's a perfect example, being far more competent and at the lower levels, and then have people that are your supervisor and your supervisor's supervisor and the directors, and literally not have any clue about anything. But cronyism, I actually knew a case in New York City where it was a Black female agent who had been I think she'd been a forensic coroner or something. She was very, very competent. She worked a whole case of a killing of a joint terrorism task force officer. She got the guys. It was all ready to go to trial, and they took the case away from her and gave it to a white friend of the supervisor. So, and by the way, that guy rose up, I want to say, to become assistant director, the guy that they gave the case to. Back when he was just a GS-13 agent, he got a case handed to him because he was buddies with the supervisor at the time, and he rose up to be like an assistant director, maybe even acting director. But that is how this Peter principle works, and it does explain a lot. But people don't like to know that, because it really does. It's a scarier proposition in some ways, that this kind of incompetence and cronyism and kind of a form of corruption, infects our institutions and our structures so badly that it's actually scarier than believing that there's like evil. Like our movies will show some evil, character who's smart, an evil genius. Mm-hmm. We'd almost prefer to believe that there's an evil genius than this Peter principle. And I've seen this over and over, but it's a problem. And yes, Peter principles, guess what they do? They have huge ego defenses, because by and large they don't have the confidence. They actually lack self-confidence when it push comes to shove. And so they're nothing but ego defense. So they lie all the time. And that's how they got ahead. Even politicians are like this kind of, in a way. They're always saying things that they think people want to hear instead of the truth.
Yep. I was just having this conversation with another friend this morning about the studies that come out every few years or so that say, surprisingly and coincidentally and interestingly, psychopaths and politicians share many of the same characteristics, which is just another way of saying politicians are psychopaths. They probably usually are, born to a better educated family. And so instead of going to the penitentiary, they go into politics or become a cop themselves and put other people in the pen. And then they get to, act with license to do whatever they want to other people and get away with it.
I have a whole PowerPoint on psychopathy and propaganda. And it's based on this book, which I highly recommend. It's maybe 10 years old now, called The Wisdom of Psychopaths by Kevin Dutton. And it's got charts in there. It's not just politicians. All leaders will possess psychopathic talents. It's not that they're bad things. We think of we think of serial killers, of course. Well, that's only a fraction of 1% of all psychopaths.
Right. In fact, I got a really nice email from a psychopath who said, listen, I don't care about anyone except myself and my own people, but I would never hurt anyone. Thank you very much. Like he was kind of offended that I was conflating that term with someone who would actually do something bad to someone, when that's really not the same thing, is it?
That's right. There's a subset of psychopaths who are serial killers, who actually get their only joy in life is, torturing somebody to death, etc. So that's a very small subset. Most people with these talents are courageous. They are very persevering. They are very focused. We think of focus, for instance, and persevering, even never giving up, keep trying, whatever. We think of those as positive leadership traits. And in fact, they are psychopathic traits. Most normal people will give up. They will say, hey, I tried this once or twice. I'm going to give up. A psychopath keeps trying. And so in the personal ambition, we think of that, ambition is considered to be a positive trait. So, but when it goes too far, a little bit of these things, you could become a surgeon and focus. There's all kinds of professions that people with some of those traits end up in, including political leadership. But when you possess that gamut, you have to understand that those are the traits. And that's just the way civilization, and since the beginning of all time, this is the way human civilization has always been structured. Equally problematic, besides the leader, is the groupies, the followers. And you see this very clearly with the Russiagate and Rachel Maddow, switching over from writing a book about peace now to being one of our main warmongers, having Brennan on every other day. And you see in all of her followers that you thought, you thought they had principles, whatever. No, they all switch over. And that's because people are very emotionally vulnerable. One thing a psychopath doesn't have, they do not have emotional vulnerability, but most people do. And most people think of it as a good thing. Oh, I'm empathetic. I have empathy. That's a good thing. Well, actually, no. An excess of empathy, which 2/3 of all people have, is emotional vulnerability, and it leads them to be very, very vulnerable and susceptible to charlatan people that are, using fear and hate and scapegoating because they're manipulating those people. And that's what, again, this is the history of the world is this. I think there's probably very little we can do about it. There's maybe some things we can do about it, but we can't change it overnight. But what we can do is be aware of this right now. If we're aware of it, that goes a long ways to trying to tell people, hey, facts matter, not your emotions.
Yeah.
And
yeah, right. And if you're going to be emotional about it, mistrust and distrust, the burden of proof is on them, especially after everything that they've said this whole time has been wrong and so destructive. How could anyone have believed Russiagate after Syria? And how could anyone have believed in all the propaganda about Syria after Iraq? And et cetera, all the way back. At some point, we should be good and inoculated against these narratives,
I never cease to be amazed that people who I thought had minds, yet when their leader or someone they know and trust tells them something, it can be as silly as like you mentioned in the Steele dossier. It could be that Syria is Assad is using chemical weapons. I mean, I saw good peace activists here that fell for every bit of that simply because their leaders were telling them that. And it's the same thing with Rachel Maddow and the Russiagate. And there's a way to again, I think if you understand what's going on, maybe there's a way we can deal with it. By the way, if you ever get a request for a talk on this, I have a whole PowerPoint on this issue on psychopathy. And so, I'd love to go and talk more about it because I think if more people understood it, I think we'd have a better chance of dealing with it as well.
Well, how about writing an article about it for the Libertarian Institute?
Well, maybe I'll look at my PowerPoint again. I don't know. We take care of our grandchildren now during the coronavirus, so I'm homeschooling. Cool. And, at the end of the day, I'm going to oh my gosh, I'm worn out. And I wrote the Flynn article is like the first article I've written in some time. But I'll think about it, and maybe we could co-write one. That would be good too. But getting back to J. Edgar Hoover, I don't think anybody wants to go back to the time of J. Edgar Hoover. If the situation right now, if people do not put some hard thought into what has happened and how this is a perfect example of how this is really all of the things when they, reduced the standards after 9/11, it's a perfect example of what it has led to and how it needs to be fixed right now. Otherwise, we go back to a Frank Church being monitored by the NSA, our senators and everybody else. And here we are. We've seen it already happen. And I think that we're on the verge of one of two ways. We can try to fix it now, or we can just continue on into this, the empire rotting from the inside.
Yep. All right, you guys, that is the great Coleen Rowley, writing again at consortiumnews.com. This one is called Ghost of J. Edgar, Haunts Flynn Investigation. Thanks so much for your time, Coleen. Great to talk to you.
Yep, thank you.
The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.